The USS Thresher, a nuclear-powered attack submarine, sank and broke apart during a test dive off Cape Cod. Twisted pieces were later found on the ocean floor.
It started as a routine dive and ended as one of the darkest mysteries in naval history. In a matter of minutes, the USS Thresher, the pride of America's submarine fleet, disappeared without a single distress call. No wreckage, no survivors, just silence beneath the waves. For over 60 years, theories have clashed, files have been sealed, and the truth buried under layers of classified silence. But now, shocking new evidence has surfaced. Evidence that rewrites everything we thought we knew about that tragic day. What really caused the Thresher to sink? Was it a mechanical failure, or something far more sinister? This is the untold story of the USS Thresher, and the chilling truth that finally explains what happened beneath the waves. But before we dive in, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single twist in this story. Let's find out. A cold case from the deep. In the early 60s, at the height of the Cold War, the oceans had become battlegrounds of stealth and supremacy. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a race not just for space, but for dominance beneath the sea. Nuclear submarines were the new titans, silent, lethal, and almost undetectable. Among them, one vessel stood out, the USS Thresher. Commissioned in 1961, the USS Thresher, SSN 593, was a marvel of military engineering. She was the lead ship of a new class of fast attack submarines and represented the cutting edge of underwater warfare. With a sleek hydrodynamic design, a powerful S-5W nuclear reactor, and state-of-the-art sonar and weapons systems, Thresher was built to hunt and kill enemy submarines with unprecedented speed and precision. The Navy touted her as safer, stronger, and more capable than any sub before her. But the pride and promise didn't last long. On the morning of April 10, 1963, Thresher set out on what was supposed to be a routine deep dive test off the coast of Cape Cod. She was accompanied by the submarine rescue ship Skylark, which remained on the surface, monitoring communications. As the Thresher descended past 1,000 feet, she reported a minor problem, then went silent. No mayday, no distress signal, just gone. At first, the Navy hoped for a communications malfunction. Maybe Thresher would surface. Maybe it was just radio trouble. But hours passed, and there was nothing. Then came the reports. Debris found floating on the surface, shards of metal, insulation, and other fragments unmistakably linked to the sub. The devastating truth settled in. Thresher had been lost, along with all 129 souls aboard. It was the deadliest submarine disaster in U.S. history, and to this day, one of the most haunting. The crew included 16 officers, 96 enlisted sailors, and 17 civilian technicians and engineers from shipbuilding companies who were observing the test. These weren't just military men, they were scientists, engineers, husbands, sons. Their loss sent shockwaves through the Navy, the defense industry, and the American public. Yet, from the start, the details were murky. The Navy released only limited information, attributing the loss to a likely mechanical failure, possibly involving a pipe rupture that led to flooding. But the explanation felt thin, especially for a vessel that had undergone the most rigorous design and construction standards of its time. How could something so advanced, so seemingly invincible, simply implode? Whispers began to circulate in military circles. Was it a failure in the submarine's design? A human error? Or something more systemic? A culture of cutting corners in the rush to outpace the Soviets? Families of the lost crew wanted answers. So did the public. But answers weren't easy to come by, not when much of the information was classified. and the wreckage lay deep on the ocean floor, far beyond reach at the time. For decades, the Thresher became something of a ghost story in the Navy, a grim reminder of how unforgiving the deep sea can be. Every generation of submariners knew her name. She was a symbol of sacrifice and mystery, an ever-present warning about the price of failure in the unforgiving world of undersea warfare. In the years that followed, small pieces of information trickled out. Investigations pointed to a possible brazed joint failure in the high-pressure seawater piping system. The idea was that a leak might have caused electrical problems and an automatic reactor shutdown, leaving Thresher powerless and unable to surface. But that theory, while plausible, was never confirmed, and the Navy's own records remained frustratingly vague. It didn't help that much of the material was heavily redacted or locked behind decades of classification. As a result, the Thresher's final moments became a puzzle no one could fully solve. It was a mystery wrapped in engineering jargon, Cold War politics, and military secrecy. Still, one thing was clear: something had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. And while the official story focused on technical malfunctions, others weren't so convinced that was the whole truth. After all, this wasn't just an accident, it was a national tragedy with consequences that would ripple through naval operations, safety protocols, and submarine design for decades to come. Yet, somehow, it had faded from public memory, quietly filed away as a Cold War footnote. Until now. Because recently, thanks to breakthroughs in underwater exploration, declassified documents, and some very persistent researchers, new answers have begun to surface. And what they reveal isn't just tragic, it's unsettling. The loss of the Thresher wasn't simply a fluke or an act of nature. It was the result of a deeply flawed system, one that ignored warnings, rushed production, and ultimately sacrificed safety for speed. The breakthrough. For decades, the USS Thresher lay silent and broken somewhere deep in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the reach of divers, beyond the limits of mid-20th century technology, and well beyond public understanding. It was a Cold War tragedy with no clear ending, until now. The breakthrough didn't happen overnight. In fact, solving the mystery of the Thresher was like assembling a massive underwater jigsaw puzzle, with pieces scattered across classified reports, fragile human memories, and nearly 8,400 feet of ocean. But over time, those pieces began to come together, thanks to a combination of technological evolution, declassification efforts, and sheer determination from both inside and outside the Navy. Let's break it down. The first major turning point came when underwater imaging technology finally caught up with human curiosity. In the early 80s, legendary oceanographer Dr. Robert Ballard, the same man who would later discover the Titanic, was quietly commissioned by the U.S. Navy to locate and document the remains of both the USS Scorpion and the Thresher. Using deep-sea submersibles and remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, Ballard and his team found the Thresher's wreckage about 220 miles east of Cape Cod, resting nearly 1.5 miles below the surface. What they saw was haunting. The Thresher had imploded under extreme pressure, shattered into thousands of pieces. The force of the collapse had been so violent that it essentially vaporized parts of the sub. The front sections were unrecognizable. It was clear that the crew would not have suffered long. The sub would have crumpled in milliseconds. That's the brutal reality of the deep ocean. There is no mercy at crush depth. But while the images were harrowing, they weren't enough to explain why the sub had imploded. The next big piece of the puzzle didn't come from the ocean, it came from paper. In 2019, after decades of pressure from family members of the victims and independent researchers, the U.S. Navy began releasing hundreds of pages of once classified documents related to the Thresher's final dive. These documents included internal memos, engineering assessments, testimony from naval officers, and data from the inquiry held after the disaster. Buried within these dry pages were revelations that raised more questions than answers. One key takeaway? The Thresher may have never stood a chance. The emerging consensus pointed to a failure in the submarine's high-pressure seawater piping system, particularly a silver-brazed joint that cracked under stress. This joint likely ruptured during the deep dive test, spraying seawater onto electrical systems, shorting them out, and triggering a reactor scram, an emergency shutdown of the nuclear reactor. With no power, no propulsion, and no way to blow the ballast tanks due to moisture freezing in the compressed air lines, the Thresher began to descend uncontrollably. She was essentially dead in the water, sinking like a stone. The hull, although strong, had its limits, and at around 1,300 feet, those limits were exceeded. It all happened within minutes. Adding even more clarity were recently analyzed recordings from the U.S. Navy's ASOS system, a network of underwater microphones originally designed to track Soviet submarines during the Cold War. These underwater ears picked up acoustic signatures from the Thresher's final moments, the sounds of mechanical failures, increasingly frantic communication attempts, and then, unmistakably, the implosion. Naval acousticians were able to piece together a second-by-second timeline of the disaster. One moment, the Thresher was trying to surface. The next, she was gone. The implosion itself, they found, happened at a depth far exceeding her design limits. A terrifying confirmation that the crew never regained control. On the surface, it may seem like a mechanical failure, a tragic but simple accident. But the deeper you look, the more disturbing it gets. These failures weren't entirely unexpected. In fact, problems with brazed joints had been reported during the Thresher's construction. Warnings were issued. Simulations raised red flags. But the pressure to commission the Navy's most advanced sub, especially during the Cold War, meant those concerns were never fully addressed. It gets worse. The test dive wasn't adequately supported with safety measures. There was no emergency sub on standby. The Skylark, the surface ship accompanying the Thresher, had limited ability to help if something went wrong. Communication systems were primitive. And the compressed air system that could have saved the sub? It had moisture buildup that froze at depth, rendering it useless. In short, a perfect storm of technical vulnerability, procedural gaps, and systemic overconfidence led to the disaster. None of this information would have seen the light of day if not for the persistence of individuals like Captain James Bryant, a retired naval officer who fought tirelessly for the release of classified Thresher documents. He and other advocates filed lawsuits, wrote petitions, and applied public pressure for years, arguing that transparency was not just owed to the families, but critical to naval safety moving forward. They were right, and the Navy, under mounting pressure, finally began to open the vault. Now, for the first time in over 60 years, we have a detailed, documented, technically supported account of what likely happened to the Thresher. Not just a theory, but a multi-sourced, data-backed explanation. The mystery is no longer unsolved, but the resolution is anything but comforting. Because what we now know is this: the Thresher wasn't lost to the unknown. It was lost to a deadly combination of avoidable flaws, human oversight, and a system that pushed too hard, too fast, with fatal consequences. This is where it goes wrong: technical failures and human error. When acoustic recordings and declassified documents were finally examined in full, a chilling reality became clear. The loss of the USS Thresher wasn't the result of a single freak accident, but a chain reaction of failures. It wasn't just one mistake or one weak point, it was many, stacked together, all allowed to exist within a system that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of American military engineering. In short, this was a disaster built gradually, over time, through a mix of technical weaknesses, ignored warnings, systemic pressure, and human error. A key problem revolved around the Thresher's high-pressure seawater piping system, specifically the silver-brazed joints. Instead of being welded for maximum strength, these pipes were joined using a high-temperature alloy called silver brazing. While this method was standard in some industrial settings, it proved dangerously unreliable under the extreme pressures a submarine faces deep underwater. During construction and testing of the Thresher and her sister ships, engineers found that a notable number of these joints were prone to failure under pressure. Reports showed that over 14% of joints failed testing in similar submarines. On the Thresher, it's believed that one of these joints gave way during the test dive, spraying high-pressure seawater into a compartment and triggering the fatal chain of events. Why weren't these joints replaced before the dive? The answer lies in the culture of urgency that dominated Cold War-era naval programs. Reworking the piping would have delayed the Thresher's schedule, a delay considered unacceptable when the U.S. was desperate to stay ahead of the Soviet Union. Engineers raised concerns, and internal discussions took place, but the ship was approved for testing anyway. In the end, speed was valued over safety. That leak, while serious, didn't sink the Thresher by itself. The real danger came when seawater hit critical electrical systems, triggering a reactor scram, an emergency shutdown of the nuclear power plant. While this procedure is meant to prevent a meltdown or radiation release, it has serious consequences for a submarine. Without reactor power, the sub lost propulsion, the ability to pump out water, and crucially, the ability to fight gravity. It began to sink. To counter this, the crew needed to blow the ballast tanks, forcing air in to push water out and regain buoyancy. But here, another flaw surfaced. The compressed air system feeding the ballast tanks had no moisture separators, devices that remove water from air lines. At deep sea temperatures, moisture in the lines froze solid, jamming the valves. When the crew tried to blow the tanks and surface, nothing happened. The system was frozen shut. The Thresher continued its descent. These cascading failures were worsened by a lack of emergency preparedness and insufficient crew training. At the time, deep dive protocols and reactor scram recovery procedures were still being developed. Simulated emergency drills hadn't fully prepared the crew for such a complex crisis, and without propulsion or control over buoyancy, their options were extremely limited. Even worse, the Skylark, the surface ship monitoring the test, had no way to intervene or help. It could only receive communications, not perform a rescue. Layered over all of this was a deeply rooted culture of overconfidence. Post-World War II naval leadership trusted in the superiority of American technology and the skill of their submariners. Submarine development, especially nuclear-powered vessels, was seen as the Navy's crowning achievement. Criticism or delays were often interpreted as weakness or obstruction. In that environment, risks were minimized and concerns brushed aside. The Thresher embodied this mentality, a vessel that appeared invincible on paper, but carried hidden vulnerabilities that only became apparent in crisis. In hindsight, it's clear that no single failure doomed the Thresher. It was a catastrophic chain reaction. A brazed joint ruptured, letting seawater flood a compartment. That flooding caused electrical systems to fail, which triggered an emergency shutdown of the reactor. With the reactor offline, the submarine lost propulsion. When the crew tried to blow the ballast tanks to surface, the system failed due to frozen moisture in the air lines. With no way to rise and no power to counter the descent, the submarine sank until the immense pressure crushed the hull. Each of these failures was avoidable. Each was known, or at least strongly suspected, before the dive. But the combination of deployment pressure, incomplete safety testing, inadequate emergency infrastructure, and a culture of overconfidence created the perfect storm. What makes it even worse is that this wasn't entirely unforeseeable. The problems weren't hidden, they were buried beneath bureaucracy and urgency. Had the silver-brazed joints been reworked, had moisture separators been installed in the air system, and had proper rescue protocols existed, the Thresher might have surfaced. Or, at the very least, the crew could have had a fighting chance. Instead, 129 lives were lost in less than 2 minutes. Not from enemy action or an act of God, but because a system allowed small, fixable problems to combine into an unimaginable disaster. The sinking of the Thresher was preventable. That is the most sobering truth of all. What this means for naval technology today. The sinking of the USS Thresher in 1963 sent shockwaves through the Navy, but its impact didn't stop there. In many ways, Thresher continues to shape naval operations today. The lessons from that tragic morning have echoed through generations of engineers, commanders, and policymakers. Beyond the immediate aftermath and the creation of SubSafe, Thresher revealed something even more lasting, something still relevant in today's world of advanced military tech. When innovation moves faster than accountability, lives are at risk. Let's start with what changed permanently in submarine safety and engineering. After Thresher, the Navy could no longer rely on optimistic assumptions or outdated testing methods. The SubSafe program, born from the disaster, became the gold standard not just for U.S. submarines, but for high-risk engineering worldwide. Before Thresher, many systems were installed and tested with flexibility, left to individual contractors or shipyards. Afterward, that changed. SubSafe introduced absolute accountability. Every pipe, valve, weld, and connection crucial to a submarine's ability to recover from flooding or propulsion loss had to be traceable, tested, and documented. Quality assurance moved to the forefront. Engineers were required to certify, sign off, and verify, with real consequences if standards weren't met. And it worked. Since its implementation, no submarine certified under SubSafe has been lost. That's not just a bureaucratic win. That's thousands of lives saved across decades of secret patrols and deep-sea operations. Rarely does a safety initiative achieve such a perfect record. But while SubSafe is a technical success, Thresher's broader lessons reach into how we handle innovation under pressure. The Cold War set the stage for Thresher. The US and Soviet Union were locked in a quiet arms race beneath the ocean, building faster, deeper diving, more capable nuclear subs. Speed and technological superiority were seen as essential. Being first mattered more than being thorough. That pressure hasn't disappeared. Today, it's playing out in fields like AI-driven defense, hypersonic weapons, autonomous vessels, and undersea drones. Once again, countries are racing to deploy cutting-edge tech, and history warns us of the danger when safety and oversight are sacrificed in the name of speed. Thresher is a powerful reminder that even the most advanced machines are vulnerable to simple failures. A cracked pipe joint, a frozen valve, a missed checklist step. These small issues can quickly spiral when oversight is weak or concerns are ignored. In today's defense world, where much of the tech is classified, outsourced, or algorithmically driven, we have to ask, will the race to be first come at the cost of being right? One of Thresher's quieter legacies lies in engineering ethics. After the disaster, many engineers began rethinking their roles. It was no longer enough to design systems that should work. The new mindset focused on designing for failure, building systems to anticipate, survive, or recover from the worst. This philosophy spread beyond submarines to aerospace, nuclear power, even space exploration. NASA's reforms after the Challenger and Columbia disasters closely mirrored sub-safe principles. Detailed documentation, built-in redundancy, aggressive testing, and a culture that listens to safety concerns no matter where they come from. In this way, Thresher became an early tragic case study in systemic failure and the importance of safety culture. It forced a reckoning not just with flawed technology, but with flawed assumptions. It proved that bad systems can function for a long time, until they suddenly don't. Today, for submariners, Thresher isn't just history. She's a constant presence. Her story is taught in Naval Nuclear Power School. Her name is etched into memorials, worn on patches, and spoken with solemnity. Every new nuclear sub is certified under the legacy Thresher left behind. But Thresher also speaks to civilians, especially in an age dominated by complex, often opaque systems. From AI managing critical infrastructure to algorithms shaping military strategy, we're placing enormous trust in technologies that seem unbreakable until they fail. The lesson? Transparency, testing, and accountability matter, even when no one's watching, especially then. We must be wary of claims that a system is too advanced to fail or too complex to explain. Those were the same assumptions that led to Thresher's loss, and they are just as dangerous today. In many ways, Thresher is now a ghost in the Navy, always present, always watching. She reminds sailors, engineers, and commanders what happens when small problems are ignored, when dissent is silenced, or when ambition overtakes safety. And perhaps most importantly, she reminds us that every line on a blueprint, every checklist, every decision, they aren't just technical details, they are lives. One faulty joint cost $129. Thresher's story still matters, not just as a historical tragedy, but as a living blueprint for how we handle risk, leadership, technology, and the value of human life. Thanks for sticking with me till the end. See you in the next upload.